Good morning. Welcome back to the Deep 404. Avdeevka has fallen and fallen in its entirety. There's been an announcement from Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Syrskyi. He has said that he had requested or ordered a full retreat from the coke plant area. This has now happened. So in very rapid fashion, the Russian forces have taken Avdeevka, what was a 2-month-long press upon the township of Avdeevka, collapsed in the last 24 to 36 hours. Such that now the entirety of Avdeevka has fallen to the Russians, and the Russians have begun to make this look like a rout. They are pushing west of Avdeevka already. I might just go to the map here. So this is Avdeevka here. Here's the quarry lake and the coke plant area here at the top. Lastochny. This little township, it's a couple of kilometres, I think, let's have a look. 2 kilometres to the west. The Russian forces are now taking Lastochny, and we're getting reports that Ukrainian troops are trying to prepare to secure Orlivka, and are forming up along this roadway here, Semenivka and towards Berichi. Stepovo, the Russians have had control over this sort of for some time. So it seems as though the Russians will look to push back across this main supply road, taking Lastochny, then Orlivka. Then if we move out a little bit, continuing up this road here along the train line of Stepovo up to Ochretny, likely to take this area here before then moving towards Pokrovsk, heading in this direction here. The collapse of Avdeevka has been quite a disaster for General Syrskyi in his first day or so on the job. There were reports that he had committed to President Zelensky that they would hold Avdeevka. There were troops pulled, the 3rd Brigade pulled out of Zaporozhia, sent into Avdeevka. I saw some other unsettling video footage today. I'll mention it briefly. I can't corroborate it. It was a Ukrainian woman speaking in Ukrainian, and I unfortunately cannot speak Ukrainian, so I was just going on who had posted it and what they had said. But it appeared to have been a group of women who, in uniform, who were being sent to Avdeevka. This wasn't what they had, it seemed, what they had believed they were intended to be doing in the military in Ukraine, but they were being sent to Avdeevka. Now, whether that footage came from before, a couple of days ago, and they actually made it to Avdeevka, I don't know, or if it was... if they were perhaps spared that. If the footage was from yesterday, they may not have got there in time. There is some other footage, of course, which I think just leads to indicate the big morale loss and the defeat that this is for Syrskyi and for the Ukrainian armed forces. There are Russian video reports now from within Avdeevka speaking of many wounded Ukrainian soldiers being left behind. And showing many bodies and corpses along the escape routes. So yesterday, it seems, as Ukrainian forces were attempting to escape, many were unsuccessful and lost their lives doing that, and many were wounded and left behind. So the situation had become, as many had suggested, critical, such that the evacuation of wounded troops could not occur. We talked about this yesterday in a video of a video phone call between a Ukrainian soldier and his girlfriend, where she was just distressed and hysterical, not knowing what she could do to help, and him saying, "I'm laying here, I'm wounded. They meant to come and get us last night. They couldn't come and get us. We spoke to someone. He thinks I'm the commander, and was telling me, don't tell the wounded guys, but we're not going to be able to get them out. Didn't realise this guy was wounded himself." Now, hopefully, he's a young bloke. Hopefully, he survived and is now a prisoner of war and will be treated along the guidelines of what should happen there. Will ultimately get home to see his girlfriend, and hopefully his wounding's not too bad. There was a lot of footage coming out yesterday of the evacuation. The 3rd Brigade, which is the reconstituted Azov Brigade, pulled in from Zaporozhia rapidly to assist and hold Avdeevka. Some people believing that Syrskyi's reasoning in pulling in the 3rd Brigade there was because they were loyalists to former General Zaluzhny, and that Zelensky's falling popularity, Syrskyi's lower popularity compared to Zaluzhny, may have led them to want to consider the idea of attempting a military coup, overthrowing Syrskyi and overthrowing Zelensky. And that's the reason why the 3rd Brigade were thrown into Avdeevka at this critical time. An attempt to reduce their capability, inflict losses upon them, so that those brigades would not be powerful and capable of attempting a coup. Now, whether that did play or factor into General Syrskyi's mind, I don't know. It is unlikely that we would ever hear that admitted by him in the future, but it does seem like something you might attempt in the failing, crumbling, perhaps last stages of the Zelensky administration. It's not getting the funding that it needs to continue this fight from the United States. There was an interesting exchange in Munich yesterday between Kamala Harris, the American vice president, and the President Zelensky of Ukraine, where Zelensky seemed to be trying to threaten the United States with them losing their strategic partner status with Ukraine. If you guys don't give us funding, well, we won't be able to let you be strategic partners anymore. And I think the Americans were going, okay. Kamala Harris also went on to sort of hint back that if we don't give you the funding, we won't be strategic partners anymore. So not good signs for Zelensky and his administration and his ability to continue this fight. What has happened with the move in Avdeevka, the collapse of Avdeevka, and then the move rapidly a couple of kilometres to Lastochny, to the west, and what will likely continue along there. And the reason I'm suggesting it may continue is that there are reporting from Ukrainian channels. This is from Resident. I'll just read here. They say, our source in the General Staff said that the construction of defensive structures was disrupted throughout the country, and the reason is trivial. The Office of the President gave funding to regional military administrations which share the funding. Corruption in the construction of defensive structures is the main reason for the delay in construction. So this is something that's been spoken about for a while. One of the reasons that General Zaluzhny was reportedly wishing to stop the fighting in Bakhmut and to just let Bakhmut go, surrender it, was to conserve forces and to be able to divert those conserved forces to the development of defensive positions. I think Zaluzhny had seen what had happened when the offensive started last June, in June of 2023, and they started to encounter the Russian defensive lines. And they didn't even really make it to the Surovikin line, the really solid Russian defences. So Zaluzhny would have been thinking, okay, if this doesn't go well for us and we need to go on the defensive, we need to be building some structures like this or we're just going to be overrun. Now, what we're hearing here from a Ukrainian Telegram source, and this source does seem to provide good reporting, is that there are problems and there are delays. Now, there are no time for delays now in defensive positions for Ukraine. In Donetsk, they are on the back foot and they are being pushed westwards. So if there haven't been defensive positions correctly constructed already, then this may turn into a rout to the west of Donetsk, where the Russians are just able to continue to push the Ukrainians back and run them back. If something like this were to happen earlier in the conflict, it would be far more difficult because Ukraine would have had a lot of men who were experienced and trained. They would have had a lot of equipment, which could have positioned themselves to hold back the Russians as the Russians made an advance. But now the Ukrainians don't have air defence to the level they had before. They don't have an air force to the level that they had before. They're lacking artillery to be able to hold the Russians at bay. So there is a real chance of us starting to see a rout here. And if we go back to the map, so again, this is Avdeevka here. We've zoomed out a little bit, Lastochny, where the Russians are now, and they'll be looking to move through Orlivka and Semenivka up to Berichi, from Stepova up into Ochotny, and then to Pokrovsk over here. But we also see then with Donetsk and Mariinka down in this area here that if we zoom out, we've also got reports of Russians starting to put pressure here on the Varemka ledge here around Urozhny in here and the Skuchny up in here. And so if a push starts up this way, then we can see that once Marinka is taken here, the road to Vuldaha is being cut off. If this push comes back up to here, these access roads start to be cut off, and then you've got Constantinople here runs or looks to be a major crossroads area. If Pokrovsk is taken above it, then this road is cut off. You can see how then quickly, with some pressure from here, the Russians then open up this entire area. They start pushing the Ukrainians back westward of Pokrovsk here. Now, if defensive positions haven't been properly prepared, then that can continue. And it doesn't take too long before what is happening down here now in Robotny and Verbova. Reports now that there are large numbers of Russian troops in the Zaporozhia region, that they are starting to push the Ukrainians back from their positions around Robotny. What is concerning, if the reporting is correct, from the Russians, is that the fighting is not particularly heavy, and yet they are taking Ukrainian positions. Now, that may just be some propaganda to keep morale high, or it may be an indication that with the word of Avdeevka collapsing, that the forces in Robotny and Verbova are now starting to think to themselves, well, what's the point? You know, if Syrskyi has called a retreat on Avdeevka, well, what's to say it won't just happen here? And why should we wait around and hold these positions? These are the problems when morale drops that you get. So the reports, as I say, may be incorrect that the Russians are taking positions without much fight from the Ukrainians. If they are correct, then you would expect that we will see the Ukrainian advances that made it as far as Verbova, made it and touched the Surovikin defensive line across here. All of this may be undone, and that we may find within a week or so, the Russian forces have pushed back to Malotokmachka and Orkhiv here. There's also reports that around in Kamyansk here, Russian forces making advances here. So if Orkhiv is taken, then Huliapol comes under threat because a move could be made to Olmyent here, and you cut off this supply road. Supply roads from this side are cut off, and you can see how very quickly the Russians are starting to be capable to push from Donetsk westward all the way over here, perhaps ultimately moving towards Pavlograd, and getting themselves to here, to be paralleling the vertical stretch of the Dnipro from Zaporozhia up into Dnipropetrovsk here. Now, this is a disaster for Ukraine if this happens in short form. The forces around Zaporozhia, look, there will be other people with far more military experience and ability to correctly estimate what's happening here. But I see this as running two possible ways, or possibly, depending on the number of troops and how successful these pushes westwards to Pokrovsk and Huliopol and these sort of things are, it might be two things at once. But it makes some sense that the Russians would look to push up here and skirt around Zaporozhia and start to cut these roads that feed into Zaporozhia. Maybe even hunt across the river here and try and cut the road between Dnipro and Zaporozhia and really make it difficult then to reinforce Zaporozhia. Everything needs to come in from this way, down through this road through Nikopol. Otherwise, you've only got smaller roads through here, not major ones. Now, Nikopol, we've had reports, is coming under Russian artillery strikes. So the Russians seem to be either making it difficult here for supplies to travel through it from Kryvyi Rog, or perhaps looking to find a way across. So the two approaches that I'm talking about here, one could make sense is that the Russians will go north around Zaporozhia and start to cut off its supply lines. The other is that they will just duck under and go south, go under Zaporozhia. Now remember, this is not water anymore. This is a Novokhovka reservoir. This has been drained when the dam wall down here was destroyed some months ago. Now you just have a river flowing through here, not a large reservoir. And that's been like that for some time. That's been like that through the summer, a chance to dry out. And now the tail end of the winter, the ground may be frozen. The ground may be solid enough to support heavy vehicles in some areas. So the Russians, I imagine, are looking, the second approach is looking for ways to get across the Dnieper River to be able to take Mykolaiv and then go further west and take Odessa. In my mind, it makes complete strategic sense that part of the end game here will be that Mykolaiv and Odessa fall under Russian control. That strategically, that deprives what remains of Ukraine of having port access. That stops immediately all of the threat of waterborne sea drones on the Black Sea Fleet, which have been perhaps the largest embarrassment for the Russian armed forces in this conflict has been the experiment that has been carried out with drone technology in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians have demonstrated successful use of asymmetric warfare here, where they have used cheaply priced unmanned vehicles, drones, sea drones, and they have had outsized success in destroying and sinking Russian military ships. So the Russians can try to somehow counteract those drones with sea drones, and this will go on forever, and they'll soon lose more ships, or they can take Odessa and Mykolaiv. They can just take this area, and that's what I believe they will do. So I think what we're starting to see in Zaporozhia perhaps sets up two movements. One is to go up along Zaporozhia and start to cut its supply lines. The other might be to push either to cross from Enerhodar, the nuclear power plant which Russia controls, to Nikopol, or perhaps come under Zaporozhia, come this way. Maybe get down to the Novokhovka dam here, where the dam has been destroyed, rebuild, not the dam, but rebuild a roadway across the remaining structure there to allow tanks and equipment to move across. Perhaps put some sort of barge capability on the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson down here. We have seen these recent long-range strikes by the Russians all along the western side of the Dnieper River and this line along Kherson. The Russians obviously won't want just one location to go across the Dnieper. If they all funnel into one location, then no doubt they will come under the attack of the remaining storm shadows and scalps and whatever else the Ukrainians can throw at them. But if there are multiple positions in which they come across, that makes it less likely that they would suffer damages in that type of constrained progress. So that's what I think we are likely to see from this growing activity and what appears to be successful advances now being made by the Russians in the Zaporozhia region. How quickly this all happens, look, I can't tell you. I think the next couple of days we will get that information. If we hear of continued kilometre-long advances. Now, remember, that was a 2-kilometre jump just yesterday from the outskirts of Avdeevka to Stechny, where we were looking before, in Lestochny. So if we start to see kilometres per day and kilometres per day, then this will happen very rapidly. The distance from Dnipro to Donetsk is 184 kilometres. So if you start chewing out kilometres at a time, that will go very quickly. There's also reports that Chasiv Yar, the Russians getting closer to Chasiv Yar, so Bakhmut, they're moving west this way. In the Krasny Liman area around here, approach on Terny is being made. So the Russians, once they move this line here further westwards and get to Kupiansk, they then get to the Oskol River. They can then use the Oskol River as a natural barrier on their right flank as they roll down here and start to then push all of the Ukrainian troops in this area down, because they're trapped by the river on one side and trapped by the Russian front on this side. So things could move quickly. The Russians also, remember they have forces up here in Belgorod. There have been plenty of attacks on Kharkiv and Sumy. They, of course, also, while not directly involved at this time, but if a push were to be made on Kiev, which is here, I'll just zoom out a little bit so you can see where that is in relation to everything else. This is Kiev here at the top of the Dnipro River. Belarus up here. Now, there have been Wagner forces in Belarus for some time now. They have been recruiting, so they have been building up the Belarusian army and getting recruits in Belarus. Again, it's entirely possible that while these forces from Russia may push westwards through Poltava, Sumy, work their way towards Kiev as forces come up around Zaporozhia and Dnipro, at the same time, we may find that Wagner and forces from Belarus then start to push down on the western side of Kiev, threatening it here. There's a lot that we might see in the coming weeks and months in Ukraine. One thing that could short-circuit this, of course, is if negotiations happen. Russia is in probably, or perhaps, has no real need to negotiate at this stage. Russia is on the offensive. They are making ground. I think you can ignore what a lot of the pro-Ukrainian channels are suggesting, that there are 50 to 1 death rates, 1 Ukrainian to 50 Russians. I don't think that's happening anywhere. So the Russians are moving. They don't really need to negotiate at this stage, but they're open to it. What might short-circuit it would be a change in leadership in Ukraine. If Zelensky were to go and be replaced by someone else, they may, in fact, see the writing on the wall and look to negotiate and try to negotiate some deal for Ukraine, such that it has a chance to survive and grow in the future. There are things that they might look to negotiate might be perhaps not the entire northern region around Chernihiv and Kiev falling to the Russians, so that perhaps all of Kiev may remain as a Ukraine. They might look to negotiate access to Odessa and Mykolaiv ports for Ukrainian trade and transport. That's something which I imagine the Russians would say, yep, sure, they will become Russian ports, but we will allow you to trade through there, but all of your goods that come through will be inspected by Russian inspectors. But still the ability to trade and use the Black Sea exists. There will be no Ukrainian navy. There will be no Ukrainian army of any size. Any sort of armed forces of Ukraine, I imagine, would be pushed well to the west around Lvov, that sort of area. Depending upon who the new leadership is and what they agree to, obviously not joining NATO would be a part of that, and how far Russia looks to then push, as I've discussed before, a defensive, demilitarized buffer zone in Ukraine would, I guess, depend upon the relationships they have with that new leadership. So that's where I think Ukraine sits today and where we might see things move in the future. One other thing that I just want to touch on again, just briefly. I only touched on it briefly yesterday. Alexei Navalny, so the former candidate for mayor of Moscow, he has died in a Russian prison. I hinted at some of his background yesterday in the show, and I don't really want to go into it in depth today. I think in the last 24 hours, if you follow social media, you will have seen what I was hinting at there about Navalny and how he may not have been an ideal pick for the West to have as their perhaps their candidate to support to get into a real opposition role for Putin. And he's not in a real in a real opposition role for President Putin. But that has happened. The other thing I mentioned yesterday, which I wanted to mention again, because I believe this is going to play some importance in the near future. Let me just move our map a little bit here and just go back here. This is around Armenia and Azerbaijan. Let's just see if we can zoom in a little bit. Hopefully you can see that okay. So Armenia around here, Azerbaijan around here. What is very interesting about this is just the location here. Armenia and Azerbaijan, but Armenia in particular, actually shares a small border with Iran. So this is Turkey here, this is Iran here, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and Russia. Armenia, their Prime Minister, Denis Pashinyan, has made the decision to break ties with Russia, to leave the CSTO, which is like a military security agreement. It's like a small NATO, if you will. Involves Russia and Armenia and 4 other nations in the area. Armenia were meant to host the CSTO last year, about September or October of last year perhaps, and they declined to do that and suggested that, well, they don't want to leave it, but they don't see any need for military exercises to be held this year. At the same time, they engaged in military exercises with the United States. Georgia, who sit just above Armenia and border Armenia, Armenia is landlocked, they have no sea access. They have suggested that Armenia has been receiving French armoured personnel carriers and military equipment and perhaps other equipment. There is a lot of interest, and you can see why from the NATO or Western position, why they would like to have military presence and relations with Armenia, given where they are. They are at the southern foot of Russia, and they're at the northern tip of Iran. So if Armenia says, sure, we actually want to side with NATO, we'd love to get into NATO. Now, many people suggest that the area of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was in Azerbaijan and was considered traditionally to be Armenian territory, there has been wars over that. Last year, there was a relatively peaceful succession of that land back to Azerbaijan. Pashinyan said, yep, I agree, this is traditionally Azerbaijan land. And that stopped that conflict over land. It was no longer a question, and that's one of the things that is considered necessary for someone to be admitted into NATO. You can't be in a land conflict about what your borders are. And so people see this move by Pashinyan to have been one to set up the possibility of Armenia going into NATO. They have close ties and involved with relations with NATO. But if they actually did go into NATO, then the United States has the ability to place within Armenia missiles that are directed exactly at Iran. You know, it's another location where they can do that. They could even, if they wish to, go as far as put Armenia into the US nuclear sharing arrangement, which is an agreement where the United States place their tactical nuclear weapons in NATO countries. So Turkey, Germany, Italy, I think, are all members of that. They hold, it's not their own nuclear weapons, but they are American nuclear weapons housed there. So if they really wanted to put some pressure, on saber rattle with Iran, they could do that. So Armenia is a place which I think could become very strategic in the coming months. You can see from the map here, you know, we've got in the Middle East, we've got Lebanon and Israel and Gaza down here. It's not that far. This is sort of the middle ground between what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening here. This is the middle landmass. So if the United States were to get Armenia on board, put American troops in there, all of that sort of thing. Remember that Turkey is in NATO, so they would have some ability to come through Turkey if Turkey allowed it. Turkey always put in that balancing act of being a NATO nation, but being a Muslim nation and being very closely tied to Russia. This is an area I think is worthwhile keeping an eye on. Okay, hey, I just want to thank everyone who watches this channel and enjoys it. Yesterday, I made it to the 1,000 subscriber mark on YouTube, which has been a goal of mine to get there. So I want to really thank you. I hope you're enjoying the channel. I'm enjoying doing these shows. You can probably tell. But yes, a big thanks, and yeah, hopefully we keep this rolling and it stays interesting for you. All right, I'll talk to you again soon.